Hi guys, so as a starting point, I need to rectify a mistake from the last video. I need to re-thank my VIPs again, but this time including all of their names. I'm not sure what happened there, but please accept my apologies and also my thanks for your support. Anyway, on with the video. On the morning of Saturday the 27th of March 2004, a man called Paul Boren sped over to the Arrowwood apartments in Sherman, Texas. Inside apartment 340 lived his daughter, 20-year-old Laura Boren, as well as his two grandchildren, aged just 13 months and 4 years old. Paul was terrified, as Laura's mentally ill and dangerous estranged husband, Andre Thomas, had been seen walking in the direction of the complex. He was a schizophrenic who had been experiencing hallucinations for years, had previously stabbed his brother, and just 2 days before had stabbed himself. Paul barreled up the stairs, only to find the apartment broken into, and he walked into a scene of absolute horror. Everyone inside was dead. They'd all been stabbed to death and had gaping wounds in their chests, and the hearts of both children had been removed. Andre Thomas was soon detained and told the police that he thought that God wanted him to kill the victims. This case is truly disturbing, not only because of the horrific murders, but the fact that whilst in prison, the killer removed both of his eyes, eating one of them. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Andre Lee Thomas was born on Thursday the 17th of March 1983 in Muskogee County, Oklahoma, into a family characterized by mental illness, violence, and substance abuse. He was the fifth child of Rochelle Thomas, and his father was called Danny Thomas. Rochelle would eventually go on to have 6 children in total, with 3 different men, none of whom hung around. Both of Andre's parents, Rochelle and Danny, had significant issues which would severely impact his development and directly link to the disturbed man he became. So with regards to Rochelle, she came from a history of abuse. She was one of 9 children, and her mother Vivian moved from abusive relationship to abusive relationship. One was with a man called Walter, who, as well as beating Vivian, also apparently molested Rochelle. In 1973, Walter put a gun to Vivian's head. One of the children, called Gregory, who was 17 years old, tried to pull the gun away and was shot in the stomach, killing him. All of this was in front of Rochelle, the abuse of her mother and the murder of her brother, and this understandably destroyed her mental health, and by her mid-teens, she was an alcoholic, suffering from severe depression. However, as well as depression, there are indicators that Rochelle suffered from schizophrenia. This is a chronic mental health condition that affects how a person thinks, feels and behaves. It has a range of symptoms, but the most prominent is psychosis, i.e. a complete break from reality. This is characterized by symptoms like hallucinations, delusions, and disorganized thinking. Reflecting this onto Andre's mother Rochelle, she apparently told people that she was chosen by God to receive his messages, with her reporting that she had visions and heard voices. So whilst nowhere does it definitively state that she had schizophrenia, it seems likely. This quote-unquote gift, as she called it, was apparently passed down by her mother Vivian, so there appears to have been generational mental illness on Andre's mother's side. With regard to Andre's father Danny, he's described as being absent for most of his son's life, only turning up when he wanted money for booze or drugs. He was an alcoholic with serious mental health issues, and also he was a cruel and violent man, knocking Rochelle around whenever he got the chance. The impact on the children, who were all boys, of growing up in this toxic environment is clear. Out of the 6, at least 3 developed significant issues in their own lives. One developed alcohol-induced dementia before he reached middle age due to years of heavy drinking, whilst another was confined to a mental health facility. However, it's clear, as we'll get to, that Andre's issues and his subsequent behaviour far outweighed that of his siblings. All of the children were also neglected. Rochelle relied on local churches to pay her bills, but even then, the house was often in squalor, with no running water, electricity or heating. She also moved constantly, dragging the children around with her. They had no stability. In fact, before he was 7 years old, Andre had attended 3 different schools in 3 different cities in 2 different states before the family eventually settled in Sherman, a city in the state of Texas, around 65 miles north of Dallas. Despite the horror of his home life, Andre initially thrived. He was a happy child and bright. In 1st grade, he was placed in the school's gifted and talented program. In 2nd grade, he was described as a, quote, strong and delightful student. Andre and his siblings would regularly attend services at their local Baptist church. He would often be seen reading his Bible. During Sunday school, Andre was an intelligent and respectful pupil. However, these early years of happiness and promise would quickly come to an end, and Andre would soon begin showing signs of mental illness. When Andre was in the 3rd grade, so when he was around 8 or 9 years old, he began to tell people that he was the character Raiden from the video game Mortal Kombat. But this didn't seem to be just the imagination of a small child. Instead, it seemed he actually believed this was reality. He also began hearing voices, and these were apparently arguments between angels and demons. By the age of 10 years old, he'd attempted to end his own existence using a razor blade, and 3 years later would do the same by sawing at his arms with a butcher knife. Andre began smoking cannabis aged 10 and drinking alcohol from age 13 to try and quieten the voices, but this only made them worse. He also began to get involved in petty crime, including damaging golf carts and stealing a car. Andre eventually ended up in a juvenile detention facility where he was given some mental health support, but there was nothing when he was released, and he continued to descend faster and faster into drug and alcohol abuse and severe mental illness. His grades cratered, and his mother Rochelle appeared completely indifferent to the deterioration of her son. In fact, in one article, it states that she later testified, although I'm unsure what environment this was in, that she had trouble keeping track of her own children and couldn't remember what schools they went to. At the age of 16 years old, Andre's life became even more complicated when he became a father with a woman called Laura Boren. She was approximately the same age as him, and the pair had been dating for 3 years. Obviously, Laura was under the age of consent in the US, but it doesn't seem like there were any criminal charges. She gave birth to a baby boy on Tuesday the 31st of August 1999 and named the child Andre Jr. Initially, Andre was a doting father. He dropped out of school and worked several jobs to try and support his son, but his mental health problems were becoming more obvious and he struggled to hold down employment. His use of cannabis and alcohol also increased, and he would often go on rants and raves about religion, and by this point, he believed that God was talking to him directly. Andre and Laura got married on Saturday the 17th of March 2001, his 18th birthday, when his bride was 17 years old, but the marriage lasted only 4 months due to his behaviour. Laura moved out of the property they shared together and took their son with her. After this point, something in Andre Thomas appeared to snap, and he rapidly descended into drink, drugs, utter madness, and violence, and 3 years later, he would murder 3 people, mutilating their bodies, with the youngest victim being just 13 months old. After his separation from Laura Boren, Andre Thomas's behaviour became more unhinged as he descended further and further into madness. He was unemployed, as well as being drunk or high, morning, noon and night. He became obsessed with apocalyptic passages in the Book of Revelation and would furiously flip through the pages of his Bible, screaming about how angels and demons were arguing in his head and he heard the voice of God. It got to the point where he began to frighten both his friends and family. Andre would also stop talking for days at a time, placing duct tape over his mouth. He also fixated on the dollar bill, looking for a code for his salvation amongst its symbols. But there were also flashes of something far more dangerous. In 2003, a year before the murders, Andre stabbed one of his brothers with a knife. He was arrested, but no charges were filed. He was apparently assessed by a mental health professional, but this didn't result in any treatment. This would not be the last time the authorities failed to step in, and they are, in part, culpable for what happened next. Due to Andre's erratic behaviour, Laura, who he was still legally married to but separated from, was restricting his access to his son, Andre Jr., trying to shield this child from the potentially dangerous behaviour of his father. Andre was only allowed to see his son if he was clean and sober, and only when her new partner, a man called Bryant Hughes, was present. Bryant and Laura had gotten together after the latter's marriage breakdown, and they had a daughter together called Leah, who was born on Tuesday the 23rd of February 2003. They lived in apartment 340 at the Arrowwood Apartments at 1200 West Taylor Street in Sherman. In contrast, demonstrating how his life was falling apart, Andre Thomas was living in a trailer around 2.5 miles away in Texoma Parkway. He had also started a relationship with a woman called Carmen Hayes, an alcoholic and drug addict, and this exacerbated his descent. In early 2004, the pair began abusing Corsetine cold medication, which can cause euphoria, agitation, and psychosis, so you can imagine what it did to a man who was already seriously mentally ill. According to Carmen, when Andre was abusing this cold medication, he would lie on the ground, rambling utter nonsense. On Sunday the 7th of March 2004, 20 days before the murders, Andre Thomas overdosed on Corsetine tablets and was taken to Texoma Medical Center, where he admitted that this was deliberate, and he actually asked staff to kill him. A psychiatric consult was being arranged when Andre walked out of the hospital. Recognising that he could potentially be dangerous, medical staff called Denison Police Department to raise their concerns, but there's no evidence that officers made any contact with him. During the evening of Wednesday the 24th of March 2004, 3 days before the murders, Andre rocked up at Arrowwood Apartments. He was drunk and tripping on cold medication. Carmen had also been dragged along, and she later reported how Laura had said, quote, "What is wrong with you? This is sad. You come over here all puffed up, wanting to see your son." She then turned him away, telling him not to come back unless he was clean and sober. Andre was apparently furious that Laura dared to stop him from seeing his son. Just a few hours later, in the early hours of Thursday the 25th of March, Andre Thomas drank most of a bottle of vodka, swallowed a handful of Corsetine tablets, and stabbed himself in the chest. He was rushed to hospital, and again made it obvious that he'd done this deliberately, and he apparently reported that he was a fallen angel, and that he believed by stabbing himself in the heart, he could, quote, "open the gates of heaven and pass through." The wound was not life-threatening, but Andre seemed confused that he was not dead, and decided that he was immortal. Again, before a psychiatric assessment could be organised, Andre Thomas walked out of the hospital, and the medical staff could do nothing. This was because, under Texas law at the time, and I'm unsure if this is still the case today, hospitals didn't have a legal authority to detain people who voluntarily entered their facilities in search of mental health care, but then decided to leave. This is a terrible loophole. They could literally have someone telling them they were going to kill someone, and if they left, there was nothing they could do aside from calling the police and warn them, and it's clear this was not resulting in any action. This meant that unless Andre Thomas actually did something, no one would have any real power to stop him, and just 2 days after he walked out of the hospital for the last time, he would commit a crime of almost unbelievable savagery. At around 7 p.m. on Friday the 26th of March 2004, so the day after Andre Thomas had been in hospital, and 12 hours before the murders, he went to apartment 340 at the Arrowwood Apartments in Sherman, where he spent the evening with his estranged wife Laura Boren and a new partner Bryant Hughes. In terms of his demeanour, Bryant later stated that Andre was erratic but not threatening towards either of them. Andre was allowed to have contact with his son, which suggests that outwardly he appeared relatively sober. I imagine that Andre Jr., despite everything, was likely just thrilled to be in the company of his father. He likely just wanted to play with him, show him pictures he'd drawn, tell him about his day. However, by this point, Andre would later report that he'd already decided to kill his son, which makes this last contact even more horrifying. Andre later clarified that it wasn't just his 4-year-old son that he was going to murder, he'd also decided to end the life of 13-month-old Leah and 20-year-old Laura. His rationale: Laura was a Jezebel, i.e. a whore, and the children were evil, and all three of them were possessed by demons. Andre claimed that whilst at the apartment, he, Laura and Bryant were listening to religious audio tapes. Bryant was apparently twisting a phone extension cord in his fingers whilst listening, and he took this to be a sign from God that he needed to strangle Laura and the children. Andre said that he considered killing them there and then, and went into the kitchen and picked up a knife, but decided now was not the time. At 10 p.m, he was driven home by Bryant. In the early hours of the next morning, Saturday the 27th of March 2004, Andre Thomas apparently woke to the voice of God, telling him to kill his estranged wife and the children, and that he needed to stab them to death using a different knife for each victim. According to him, he needed to use a different weapon on each victim, because if he didn't, the demons inside them would continue to live. At around 5:30 a.m, Andre, dressed all in black, left his trailer in Sherman with 3 knives tucked in his trousers, as well as carrying duct tape. He then walked the 2.5 miles to Arrowwood Apartments, which would have taken him around an hour. As he got close, Bryant Hughes, Laura's partner at the time, was driving along on his way to work, and he spotted Andre walking along close to the apartments. Bryant later said that he was haunted by the fact that at that point he didn't turn back. He was late for work and continued on his journey, but he did catch Andre's eye and threw up his hands as if to ask, "What are you doing here?" Unfortunately, in Andre's disturbed and distorted mind, he believed that Bryant was making a gesture indicating that what he was doing was right and giving him permission to slaughter a 20-year-old woman and 2 children, one of whom was only 13 months old. Andre was soon outside apartment 340, and his shoulder barged the door, forcing his way in. The first person he saw was Laura in the hallway, who apparently ran straight towards him, potentially to try and force him out, putting herself between him and the children. Andre stabbed her in the chest, with the knife passing through her heart. As he stabbed her, Laura simply said no, before slumping to the ground and dying within minutes. Both of the children, 4-year-old Andre Jr. and 13-month-old Leah, were together in the bedroom. Andre Jr., horrifyingly, knew what was about to happen. He woke up and was able to shout no before his own father plunged a knife into him. When his son was dead, the true horror in this case began. Andre opened up his chest with the knife and pulled out his lungs and his heart. One of his lungs and his heart Andre thrust into his pocket. The other lung was later found near his son's body. He then turned to Leah, who was in her crib, and using the third knife that he'd brought with him, he stabbed her to death. He then took her dead body, put it on the floor, and opened up her chest before pulling out her heart. This, like the other organs of his son, he put in his other pocket. Andre then returned to the body of Laura and hacked at her chest before pulling her ribs apart, and he began ripping out her organs. It appears that he believed he'd also removed her heart, but in fact he took out part of her lung. Andre then stabbed himself 3 times in the chest and lay down next to Laura, apparently expected to die, although it would later be determined that these stab wounds were not particularly deep. When Andre didn't die, he got up, put the organs in a paper bag, and left the house and walked back home. He dumped the bag in the rubbish outside the trailer. When he walked back in, his girlfriend, Carmen Hayes, and his cousin, Isaiah Gibbs, were present. He told them he just killed his ex-wife and the 2 children. Both believed that Andre was joking, but to prove what he was saying was true, he pointed them in the direction of the bag with the organs in and told them to look inside. He also lifted up his shirt, showing his self-inflicted knife wounds and telling them he didn't understand why he wasn't dead. Both Carmen and Isaiah could see there was blood on Andre's clothing, and they suddenly realised he was telling the truth. They then convinced Andre to give himself up and asked a neighbour to drive him to the police station. Before they left, Andre called Laura's parents, Paul and Sherry, and when no one picked up, he left a voicemail where he said, quote, Sherry, this is Andre. I need y'all's help. Something bad is happening to me, and it keeps happening. I don't know what's going on. I need some help. I think I'm in hell. I need help. Somebody needs to come and help me. I need help bad. I'm desperate. I'm afraid to go to sleep. So when you get this message, come by the house, please. Hello? So he called the parents of the woman he just killed and asked her mother to come round and help him. The reason why no one answered was because both of Laura's parents were out of the house, with her father Paul, likely around this time, speeding his way to the apartment. This is because when Brian got to work, the fact that Andre had apparently been going towards where he lived with Laura and the children bothered him. He tried to call her, but there was no response. So he called Paul and told him his concerns. As soon as Paul put down the phone, he jumped in his vehicle and raced across town towards the home of his daughter and his grandchildren. Both he and Sherry had been front and centre to the deterioration of Andre's mental health and his behaviour. They knew he was unstable and likely dangerous, and feared for their daughter. Unfortunately, Paul would be too late. When Paul got to apartment 340 at around 7 a.m, he found the door smashed in and saw the mutilated body of his daughter, who was lying naked in the hallway, a horrific wound in the left side of her chest, with her internal organs exposed. He then moved into the bedroom and saw both children lying in pools of blood. Andre Jr. was lying in his toddler bed, and Leia was on the floor. Both their chests had been hacked open, and next to Andre Jr. was one of his lungs. Paul checked all three and knew they were dead. At 7:23, he made a call to 911, and officers from Sherman Police Department, as well as paramedics, arrived within 10 minutes. It was clear that nothing could be done for the victims, and 20-year-old Laura Boren, 4-year-old Andre Lee Boren, and 13-month-old Leia Hughes were declared dead at the scene. Bryant Hughes was briefly under suspicion, but after speaking to him and Laura's father, it became apparent their main suspect, their only suspect, was Andre Thomas, and the police rushed over to the trailer park at Texoma Parkway to find him. When they entered his trailer, they recovered the murder weapons in a sink, and later they recovered the paper bag containing the victim's organs. But Andre Thomas was not there, because at this point he was in custody, having walked into a police station and confessed his crimes. He was arrested on the spot, but due to his injuries, he was transported to Wilson N. Jones Hospital for treatment. He was discharged on Monday the 29th of March 2004 and taken to Sherman Police Department, where he was interviewed for the first time. He was then booked into Grayson County Jail, where he asked to speak to detectives, so they travelled to interview him for a second time. Andre refused a lawyer and spoke freely about his crimes across both interviews. He is reported to have been calm and largely coherent throughout, and whilst he said nonsensical things which clearly indicated some level of delusion, it was later reported that, quote, he knew very much what was going on. Andre went into detail about what he'd done and gave them details that only the killer would know, including the pattern of injuries on the victims and the fact that he'd removed their organs before leaving. He again claimed that he was directed to commit these murders by God, and they were essentially acts of mercy. Killing his victims and mutilating them was a way to kill the demons which had taken over their bodies, so they could enter heaven. He had then stabbed himself in order to join them, but this had failed. Andre Thomas was subsequently charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and held in jail to await the court proceedings. On Friday the 2nd of April 2004, 6 days after the murders, Andre Thomas was sitting in his cell and was heard shouting, quote, "It's God's will." When guards went to investigate, they found that he'd pulled out his right eye and was holding it in his hands. Prior to this, he supposedly had been reading his Bible, and it was one of 2 passages which apparently inspired what he did, either Mark 5:29, which reads, quote, "If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out," or possibly Mark 9:47, which reads, quote, "And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. It is better to enter the kingdom of God with one eye than to have two eyes and be thrown into hell." Regardless, the outcome was the same. Andre Thomas had blinded himself in one eye. As a result of this incident, he was assessed by several psychiatrists who determined that Andre was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia and was unfit to stand trial. They indicated that his mental illness was separate to any alcohol or drug misuse issues. He was then sent to Vernon State Hospital for treatment and remained there for 5 weeks. Despite the views of several mental health professionals, one was dissenting, and his name was Dr. Joseph Black, chief psychiatrist for the competency program, who reported that in his opinion, Andre had been suffering from drug-induced psychosis, so everything was self-inflicted. He stated that Andre was competent to stand trial and would likely try to manipulate the court, exaggerating his underlying mental health issues to get sympathy from the jury. According to Dr. Black, him taking out his own eye was not a sign of mental illness, but a strategy to avoid the death penalty. And these were essentially the two sides of the argument when Andre Thomas's trial began on Tuesday the 15th of February 2005. This was a trial solely to determine his guilt for one murder, that of 13-month-old Laura Hughes. Why he was not tried for the other killings, I'm unsure. However, Andre's defence appears to have been borderline incompetent or potentially deliberately sabotaging the proceedings. So when it came to jury selection, 3 of the potential jurors filled in a questionnaire indicating they were opposed to interracial marriage. One in particular made his thoughts clear, writing, quote, "I don't believe God intended for this. We should stay with our bloodline." No objection was made to these jurors sitting in judgment on this case. In addition, the prosecution entered the statement from Dr. Black into evidence, the one who essentially said that all of Andre Thomas's mental health issues were self-inflicted, and again, the defence did not object. It appears that his defence counsel, R.J. Haygood, did not object because he was suffering from pancreatitis at the time of the trial and was not firing on all cylinders. He later said that he regretted the way he handled the case. Because of these serious missteps, the defence was on the back foot. They attempted to argue insanity, stating that Andre Thomas was so mentally unwell at the time of the murders that he had no control over his actions and did not fully understand what he was doing was wrong. The prosecution countered, citing a Texas law where if an individual's mental health issues are caused by or exaggerated by drugs or alcohol, an insanity defence was invalidated. They pointed to the fact that Andre had been abusing both drink and drugs in the form of cold medication before the murders. The defence pointed to Andre's behaviour after he was apprehended, including removing his own eye, apparently whilst he was not under the influence of anything. However, this was framed by the state as being a manipulative tactic, a way to wriggle out of being put to death. Andre Thomas sat impassively, completely vacant during the entire court case, sometimes sitting at the defence table, eating Skittles. If he knew what was going on, he showed no indication of this. He showed no concern for the fact that his life was on the line. But was this a lack of awareness of proceedings, or a complete lack of empathy and remorse? On Monday the 7th of July 2005, Andre Thomas was found guilty of the murder of 13-month-old Laura Hughes. 4 days later, on Friday the 11th of July, it took just over an hour for the jury to recommend that Andre should be put to death, and this was the sentence that was passed. Andre Thomas was then sent to death row, but this wouldn't be the end of his story, not even close. So Andre was back in the news when on Tuesday, December the 9th, 2008, an officer went to his cell and found him covered in blood. He had pulled out his left eye and eaten it. Apparently, this was because he was trying to stop the government from reading his thoughts. So now completely blind, Andre remained on death row. Over the next decade, appeal after appeal was lodged by Andre Thomas's new defence. They cited various issues, including the ineffectiveness of his trial counsel, but above everything was his mental state. The fact that Andre removed both of his eyes was used to indicate that he was extremely mentally unwell and should be in hospital and not a prison cell. Specifically, his attorney once said, quote, "Andre Thomas is one of the most mentally ill prisoners in Texas history. Only the most mentally ill person could undertake these acts of permanent self-mutilation." Andre Thomas was scheduled to die by lethal injection on Wednesday the 5th of April 2023, and this again led to a slew of appeals and online petitions seeking a stay of execution. This was granted on Tuesday the 7th of March 2023, giving his lawyers a chance to argue that he was too mentally unwell to be executed and that he should be committed to a mental health facility. There are no further updates. Andre Thomas is now 42 years old and remains on death row, having been there for 20 years. Whether he eventually ends his life strapped to a gurney is unclear. His name doesn't appear on a list of scheduled executions extending all the way to 2028. However, the question that still needs to be answered is whether Andre Thomas is mad or bad. This is something we'll cover in the next section. This is a really complicated case to analyse, but I want to try and determine whether Andre Thomas was, for want of a better term, mad or bad. I think the answer is both. So the information I've used to compile this video is taken from the original police reports, which has enabled me to include far more details than articles I've read on this case. This paperwork contains really important information, which I think gives a much better understanding of this case. Specifically, across several witness statements, it's clear how much Andre Thomas was struggling to cope with the fact that his relationship with Laura had ended and she had moved on with her life. Bryant Hughes, Laura's partner at the time of her death, later told police that Andre would often come over when he wasn't around and he would try to get her to run away with him to resume their relationship. Andre had told others that Laura was the love of his life, and after he returned from hospital after stabbing himself, he broke up with Carmen, his girlfriend, telling her that he didn't love her as much as he should and that Laura was the one he desired. Police also spoke to several people, including cousins of Andre Thomas, who recalled that when talking about Laura, he had said, quote, "If he couldn't have her, no one could." Several people reported him saying this and making these comments months before the murders. Also, it's clear that Andre was resentful that his contact with his son was blocked. It appears, despite turning up at the apartment drunk and off his tits, he expected to be allowed in. This added to his anger towards Laura, with him already being livid that she had moved on with her life and had a child with another man. I think Andre likely had fantasies about killing Laura for months. As to why he wanted to kill his son, I think like most domestic abusers, he simply saw his son as a prop, a chess piece, something he could use to manipulate and gain access to Laura. He didn't really have much love for his child. Potentially he resented his son because he was closer to Bryant, or had said he didn't want to see his father anymore, or most likely, killing her was something he knew would hurt Laura. It would also further erase any trace of her from the earth. With regards to 13-month-old Leia, she was the product of the union between Laura and Bryant, and so he likely saw her as an inconvenience, something that was getting in the way of him winning Laura back. She wouldn't abandon her infant, so he would kill it. So essentially, if you strip this case right back, taking away the mental health issues, I think that Andre Thomas was, like so many others I've covered on this channel, fundamentally a self-entitled, controlling man, a domestic abuser, someone who expected to get what he wanted and believed that he should be allowed to act in any manner he chose. If he couldn't get what he wanted, he would destroy everything. He would burn it all to the ground. This, I've no doubt he learned as a child. His father was an abuser, and I imagine he resented women. His mother, Rochelle, sounds like a terrible parent. She didn't care what happened to her children. She allowed them to grow up in squalor and poverty. She didn't even know what school they went to. As to where the issue of mental illness fits in, I'll start by saying it's very clear that Andre Thomas is an extremely unwell man who suffers from schizophrenia, who experienced auditory and visual hallucinations, and this is all relevant to the murders. It's clear that Andre Thomas had, for years, suffered religious-based delusions, I think that his hatred of Laura and the children and wish to kill them got folded into this. He began to hear the voice of God, who strangely enough agreed with his assessment of the situation. Laura was a whore, the children were evil, they all deserved to die. Of course, this was all just Andre's disturbed mind, twisting and turning, but it enabled him to act. It elevated his own personal grievance into something far more important, almost spiritual. Yes, he wanted these things, but God also wanted them. His mind also twisted into a rationale for his evil acts. He wasn't slaughtering people, he was killing demons inside of them. What he was going to do was actually a good thing. So I think that Andre Thomas fundamentally was an entitled, selfish man, a domestic abuser, but his mental health issues enabled him to justify acts of murder and extreme violence, turning the slaughter and mutilation of the innocent into some sort of spiritual mission, a war between good and evil. Therefore, he is both mad and bad. I'm not going to comment too much on the jury's verdict, because I don't know how I feel about it. I know there were accusations of racial bias, and this may well have been the case, but there was evidence that definitely condemned Andre Thomas, including the fact that during his police interviews, he appeared to identify that he knew what he was doing was wrong, but carried on regardless. Also, Andre appeared to have been drunk and under the influence of cold medication most of the time. Yes, whilst he was in prison, he had pulled out his own eye, but this was something he did to himself. Adding substances to the mix, he became a danger to others, including stabbing his brother and killing 3 people. So it could be argued that the difference between him being a danger to himself and a danger to others was alcohol and drugs, things he chose to take. So whilst he's clearly mentally ill, was it his own behaviour which tipped him over the edge into homicide? We can only speculate. As to whether Andre Thomas should be on death row, no, I don't think he should. He's an extremely unwell man, likely living in a world of delusion, disconnected from reality, which has resulted in him removing both of his eyes. But it's clear that Andre should never be released from confinement, and I think he should be in some sort of facility, separated from society, for the rest of his days. However, I'm not sure what's worse, being executed and being released from what I imagine for him is a scary, nonsensical world, or living in a high security hospital and being faced to endure this for decades to come. So what are your thoughts on this case? If you like the content, then consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, and you can also send a one-off donation to support the channel via the thanks button. Please like, share and subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.